Welcome to Despicable Main Deep Dives. So what are we talking about then?
It's framed as a war for really fundamental aspects of, human existence. Our freedom, our independence, individuality.
And our very humanity itself, according to the source, it really sets a very dramatic stage for the whole analysis.
It does, and the document introduces what the author calls a large-scale fraud.
A fraud.
Yeah, they claim this fraud is being driven by individuals they call conspirators. But significantly, the author doesn't just blame them.
Oh.
They state that these goals couldn't be achieved by the conspirators alone. They apparently needed collaborators.
Collaborators. Okay, and how does the source describe these collaborators? It sounds pointed.
Oh, it's very pointed language. The text calls them half-witted, mask-wearing, vaccinated buffoons who've taken part in the revolution of the woke.
That is quite the description.
It's incredibly strong, and the author explicitly states that these collaborators are, quote, just as much to blame as the alleged insane billionaire bankers and globalists they see as the main conspirators.
Okay, so the source sees the problem not just as like a small, shadowy group plotting things.
No, it's something enabled, maybe supported, by a larger chunk of the population. Actively or passively, it doesn't matter much to the author, it seems.
And the source also claims these groups use certain buzzwords almost as a kind of smokescreen.
Exactly. The source claims these alleged conspirators and collaborators use terms we hear all the time: sustainability, diversity, inclusivity, transparency.
The usual suspects, kind of.
Right. But the claim is they're not used genuinely. They're supposedly just excuses, cover for actions the source views as fundamentally negative,
Like what?
like greed, cruelty, ignorance, and selfishness. So the author sees these generally positive terms as being twisted, essentially, to serve a nefarious agenda.
Got it. So that really sets the stage for their main argument, doesn't it?
It does. The central focus of this whole document is presenting what the author calls the top 10 of the biggest lies the conspirators have told in the last 3.5 years.
Okay, a top 10 list. And the goal here is?
The author's explicit goal, laid out in the text, is to pull back the curtain, to show how these individual claimed lies linked together.
Linked together to form what?
To form what the author calls the greatest and most evil fraud in human history.
Wow.
And they state unequivocally that this entire effort, this whole structure of lies, is designed with two main purposes.
Which are?
To encourage compliance from the population, and ultimately to lead us into what they consistently refer to as the Great Reset.
The Great Reset. So the author is basically giving us their roadmap as they see it, connecting events that might seem separate.
Exactly, connecting them under one big narrative of deliberate deception. And this path, in their view, leads directly toward the specific alleged outcome, the Great Reset, which the source pretty much equates with this greatest and most evil fraud.
Right. So our task then, in this deep dive, is to walk through these claimed lies strictly as presented in the source document you provided.
Yeah, unpack each one. We'll start from number 10, work our way up to 1.
Detailing what the source says each lie is, the author's reasoning, or the purported evidence they give in the text.
And crucially, how the author claims they connect, how they all supposedly lead towards this larger alleged fraud and the Great Reset.
Okay. Before we jump into number 10, maybe we should just touch on that core premise again, the one that underpins the whole document.
Good idea, because the text constantly emphasizes this feeling of being under siege.
Right, like an ongoing existential attack on freedom and identity.
Exactly, and it's not just who is allegedly behind it, but how they're doing it. That point about needing collaborators.
Those half-witted, mask-wearing, vaccinated buffoons again.
Yeah, emphasizing that the alleged goals weren't achievable by the conspirators alone. It kind of reframes the issue, doesn't it?
It does. It makes it not just about some shadowy group, but about how, in the author's view, large segments of the population are maybe unwitting participants in this revolution of the woke that supposedly helps the conspirators.
It's a crucial part of the source's narrative. It sort of diffuses responsibility, maybe explains why the alleged fraud has been, in their eyes, so successful.
Because people haven't seen the connections.
That's what the author believes. That everything that's happened, the pandemic response, the economic shifts, social changes, has felt isolated to most people. Hard to see the pattern.
Which is why they made this list.
But explicitly, they state it's to show how these seemingly separate events do link together, forming a coherent push towards what they call the Great Reset.
It's like the author is saying, look, You're seeing individual trees, maybe just leaves, but I'm showing you the whole forest they've planted. And it's a very dark forest leading to this great reset.
That's exactly the purpose of the list,
Mm.
within the source's own framework, to reveal the alleged pattern, the underlying agenda.
All right, then. Let's get into this specific list from the source document. According to the author, the alleged top 10 of the biggest lies the conspirators have told in the last 3.5 years, driving us remorselessly into the Great Reset begin with. Number 10, the fake pandemic, the coronavirus hoax.
Okay, so this is positioned as the absolute foundation, the cornerstone of the entire alleged fraud.
The starting point.
Right. The source positions the initial COVID-19 events as a deliberate fabrication. The author's claim is stark, very direct. The COVID-19 pandemic was, from the get-go, a hoax.
A hoax built on a huge lie. And the purpose of this lie, according to the source,
Explicitly designed simply to frighten people. That's the core motivation they identify, fear itself.
fear. And what's their reasoning for calling it a hoax, claiming it was a lie?
The reasoning rests heavily on a comparison. The author claims the COVID-19 infection was no more than the annual flu.
Just like the flu.
Not just like it, they specify it was a fairly modest version of the flu. That comparison is absolutely central to their argument that the severity was wildly, deliberately exaggerated.
Okay. And does the author offer points within the text as sort of evidence for this claim?
Yes, they make several specific assertions. First, they state that governments allegedly knew, quote, by March 2020, that the COVID infection was no worse than the flu.
March 2020. That's very early.
Right. And they claim governments had supposedly officially downgraded it before the main fuss started, before the public panic really took hold.
So a claim of deliberate government deception right from the very beginning, knowing it wasn't severe, but letting the panic build anyway.
That's the allegation. What else does the source offer?
Well, the source also claims that government statistics supposedly show that the flu just disappeared when COVID-19 was prevalent.
Disappeared, yeah.
Yeah.
The author implies this statistical oddity is suspicious, suggests maybe misclassification was going on. Furthermore, they assert that the number of genuine deaths from COVID-19 was in reality no higher than in some fairly ordinary flu seasons.
Okay, so they're pointing to what they claim the official data shows, arguing mortality wasn't actually exceptional compared to a typical flu outbreak.
Exactly. They really double down on this statistical argument. They explicitly state that mortality rates for 2020 and 2021 allegedly showed no higher death rate than in other years.
That forms the core of their proof, then, that the pandemic's danger was essentially manufactured.
That's the argument presented. And how does the source connect this alleged fake pandemic, this coronavirus hoax, to the bigger picture they're painting, the Great Reset?
Well, according to the author, this initial hoax wasn't just some isolated deception.
No.
No, they see it as the fundamental base, the absolutely essential starting point for all the later lies and actions it supposedly followed.
So it's the foundation lie.
In the author's view, yes. The alleged lie upon which the entire structure of the greatest and most evil fraud and the push towards the Great Reset was built. Without that initial fear, the source implies, none of the subsequent steps would have been possible.
Got it. So if the very premise of a dangerous pandemic was a hoax designed to scare people, according to the source, then the next item on their list, number 9, seems to follow logically from that initial alleged deception.
Number 9, the PCR test.
Right. The source document takes aim squarely at the main diagnostic tool used during the alleged pandemic.
The PCR test.
Yeah. The author's claim here is that the PCR test, used everywhere for COVID-19 detection, was not only entirely useless for that specific purpose, that's the claim, but even more significantly that it was never intended to be used as a COVID-19 test at all, which implies, a deliberate misapplication of the technology.
And if it wasn't intended for that purpose, according to the source, why was it used so much?
Well, according to the author, it was used specifically to falsely label millions of patients and millions of deaths as being COVID-related.
Falsely labeled them.
That's the claim. And the author asserts this wasn't some secret or mistake. They state with real conviction, everyone knew that or they should have known it.
Wow. That suggests a level of complicity, or at least willful ignorance, among those using it.
That's the implication. A very strong statement claiming widespread knowledge of its alleged inappropriateness for diagnosing COVID.
Does the source give specific examples or evidence in the text to back up this claim of false labeling?
They provide several pretty striking examples. They claim that people who died from other causes, and they list things like heart attacks, cancer, being mugged, even hit by a bus,
Okay.
were allegedly falsely put down as COVID victims. This is the source's explanation for the high reported COVID death figures. They claim they were inflated by attributing unrelated deaths to the virus just based on a positive PCR test.
So the source is saying, if you had a positive PCR test, that could be enough to classify your death as a COVID death, no matter the actual medical reason, leading to skewed mortality numbers.
That's precisely the claim made in the source document. And the author adds another layer here, alleging a deliberate action to prevent anyone checking.
How so?
They state that postmortems were conveniently not done because authorities supposedly deemed it too dangerous. The source views this lack of autopsies not as a genuine safety measure, but as a way to avoid confirming or refuting these potentially false cause of death claims.
Preventing postmortems to hide the true cause of death, according to the source, and they link this to treatment protocols as well.
Absolutely. The text claims that following this alleged false labeling via PCR tests, murderous treatment programs were introduced widely.
Murderous, it's incredibly strong language.
It is, and at the same time, they claim effective treatment regimes were actively banned.
Does the source elaborate on what they mean by murderous treatment programs? Give examples.
Yes, the author gets very specific here, focusing on the elderly population.
Okay.
They claim the elderly were allegedly killed off in their thousands by a specific kill shot consisting of morphine and a benzodiazepine tranquilizer.
A specific drug combination.
Yes. And the author explicitly states they had warned about this exact action, along with two others, as one of the predicted aims of the alleged COVID hoax way back in March 2020, right at the start.
So the source claims they not only predicted this alleged outcome, but specifically identified this drug combination as a deliberate method used to intentionally end the lives of elderly people. Part of the original plot they supposedly uncovered.
That is precisely the claim made in the document. The author uses this to, bolster their credibility, framing it as an early warning that came true.
And what were the other two aims they claimed to have warned about back then?
They mention them alongside this. A plan to introduce compulsory vaccination programs, and a plan to use the alleged pandemic to pave the way for getting rid of cash.
Interesting. Okay, so how does the source connect this alleged misuse of the PCR test, this vital part of the lie, as they call it, to the bigger picture, the Great Reset?
According to the author, the misused PCR test was always an integral part of making the pandemic seem real.
Making it seem real.
Yeah, it wasn't just a passive tool. It was, in their view, actively used to generate false data and create the illusion of a severe, widespread pandemic.
And this illusion.
This alleged illusion, manufactured by the test, was then presented as a vital part of the lie. It underpinned the whole pandemic narrative and directly paved the way for implementing later actions tied to the Great Reset goals.
Like compulsory vaccination and getting rid of cash, which they said they predicted.
Exactly. They link its use directly to setting the stage for those things.
So in the source's narrative, the PCR test was deliberately deployed. A key instrument to create the data needed to support the fake pandemic story, which then justified measures leading towards the Great Reset.
That is exactly how the source presents it. A tool used to manipulate perception and justify the next steps in the alleged fraud.
All right, moving on to number 8 on the source's list of alleged lies. A consequence that followed directly from that perceived threat. Number 8, the lockdowns.
Right. The source describes the implementation of lockdowns with absolute conviction. They call them a big lie.
A big lie.
Yeah. The author claims that it was always obvious right from the start, to anyone paying attention apparently, that lockdowns would cause massive harm, not the public health good they were sold as.
Despite being told they were needed to protect the NHS and save lives and so on.
Right. The source insists the harmful effects are entirely predictable. And what's the author's reasoning for this claim, citing what they see as obvious damage?
Well, the author claims that now so-called experts everywhere are finally stating the obvious damage that these policies cost.
So effects the author alleges were clear from day one.
Exactly. This frames the current acknowledgement of harm, not as some new discovery, but as a kind of belated admission of something that was always obvious.
Okay. And the source details the alleged harm caused by these lockdowns.
Yes, they describe several severe consequences. They state that shutting people in their homes, isolating vulnerable care home patients, closing schools, all caused massive psychological damage.
Psychological damage.
Yeah, and the author specifically highlights the impact on children, claiming hundreds of thousands of children are now severely depressed, desperately needing help they are allegedly not getting.
That's a very strong claim about the scale, the nature of the mental health impact, particularly on young people, according to the source.
It is.
Yeah.
And the source also claims that closing hospital departments, and they make a sort of pointed, maybe derisive remark here, saying this happened while nurses were making TikTok videos, resulted in a massive increase in illness and deaths.
An increase.
Yes. And the author isn't just saying it was a temporary disruption. They predict these increases in illness and mortality will continue for decades to come.
Wow. So the source attributes significant long-term societal health problems, excess deaths, directly to the deliberate decision to shut down parts of the healthcare system during lockdowns.
Correct. Framed as a direct consequence. And the author adds another layer of accusation here.
What's that?
They assert that politicians and others in public service knew that the lockdowns were quite unnecessary and could sensibly be ignored.
Knew they were unnecessary. That suggests a deliberate choice to impose harmful policies despite knowing the potential damage.
That is a serious accusation. Claiming policymakers were aware lockdowns weren't needed and would be harmful. Does the source mention anything about, like, an official review, an inquiry into the pandemic response?
Yes, the author specifically talks about the UK COVID inquiry. They state that they personally submitted evidence to this inquiry, claiming this evidence proved their early warnings about all these alleged problems and demonstrated that the COVID scare was a hoax right from the start.
And what happened after they submitted this evidence, according to the source?
Well, according to the source, they have not yet been called to give evidence. The author states they are terribly worried that the inquiry will just turn out to be a farce. Deliberately designed, they say, to avoid the unfortunate fact that anyone who told us the truth was silenced and demonized.
Oh, that ties right into the source's broader theme, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About suppressing dissenting voices, using the inquiry as an example of an alleged attempt to avoid uncomfortable truths, protect those responsible.
Exactly. While ignoring those who allegedly had the truth early on, it's presented as evidence of the establishment's unwillingness to confront the alleged fraud.
And how does the source connect these lockdowns to the alleged Great Reset agenda?
The source views lockdowns as an absolutely critical part, albeit damaging, of the overall process.
The process of what?
Of encouraging compliance from the population. They see the negative outcomes, the psychological damage, the increased illness and death from healthcare disruption, not as unfortunate side effects,
but
as contributing factors that ultimately serve the purposes of the conspirators. It's presented as a deliberate policy choice, known to be harmful, used specifically to condition populations for further control and acceptance of drastic measures.
It sounds like the author interprets these policies not as, say, misguided attempts at public health, maybe that failed, but as highly successful tools for achieving control and compliance objectives that benefit the alleged conspirators, according to their narrative.
That is the explicit claim made in the source. The harm caused by lockdowns is framed as intentional, serving the broader alleged agenda.
Okay, moving down the list, the next alleged lie, number 7, focuses on something that became, well, a really ubiquitous symbol of the whole pandemic period. Number 7, the masks.
Right. The source is just as dismissive of mask mandates. The author claims that introducing masks, making them compulsory, was done despite clear evidence that wearing masks did far more harm than good.
So again, suggesting a deliberate policy implemented despite knowing about negative consequences, in the author's view.
That's the pattern they present. What kind of harm does the source claim masks caused, according to the text?
Well, the author lists several alleged harms, covering environmental, social, and health impacts.
Okay.
They claim discarded masks damage wildlife and the environment far more than plastic bags ever did.
Environmentally worse than plastic bags.
That's the claim.
Yeah.
Socially, they state that mask wearers allegedly terrified children and delayed the development of babies and infants.
Those are significant claims. Environmental burden, potential developmental and emotional impact on kids, according to the source.
Yes. And the source goes further on direct health effects for the wearers.
Like what?
They claim that mask wearers were more likely to develop chest infections and lots of other diseases.
Okay.
And they make a very specific and pretty controversial health claim, directly challenging, opposing information.
Which is?
Asserting it's clear that masks did accelerate the development and return of cancers because of their effect on blood oxygen levels.
Wow. Linking masks to reduced blood oxygen and accelerated cancer growth. That's a powerful claim in their narrative, especially presenting it as a truth that contradicts fact-checkers.
It is. The author uses it as an example of their claims being true while contradictory information is deliberately false.
Okay. And how does the source connect compulsory mask wearing to the alleged overall plan, the Great Reset?
According to the author, forcing people to wear masks was another key piece, an integral part of the whole process of forcing populations to be compliant.
Ah, compliance again.
Yeah. It's seen not primarily as a health measure, but as a tool of psychological conditioning, social control, getting people used to following directives that the author claims are harmful or just nonsensical.
And the source draws an analogy here, doesn't it, to illustrate this point about seemingly pointless compliance.
They do. The author explicitly compares forcing mask wearing to the recycling program.
Recycling? How so?
They claim the recycling program was also long ago proved to be utterly wasteful and pointless and expensive and environmentally damaging, despite its supposed goal.
Okay.
But, according to the source, recycling has now become regarded as a religion by mad and ignorant cultists.
All religion.
That's the word used. So the author uses recycling as a parallel example. A program they believe is irrational, wasteful, damaging, but is blindly followed by unquestioning individuals, much like they view mandatory masking.
I see. That's the parallel the author draws. To underscore their point about compliance with irrational mandates, they describe these individuals washing yogurt cartons and ignoring that the material is then mostly burnt or dumped after being shipped globally, claiming the program has actually done massive damage to the environment.
Right. This analogy serves to reinforce their view of large numbers of people just unthinkingly complying with alleged harmful programs promoted by the establishment.
It certainly paints a picture. People misled into following programs they think are good or necessary, but which are allegedly, in the source's view, wasteful, damaging, and ultimately designed to foster compliance.
Exactly. It's part of the author's broader argument that widespread, unthinking compliance from these collaborators is essential for the alleged fraud to succeed.
Okay, let's move on to number 6 on the list. This one shifts focus a bit, geographically and politically, addresses a major current event.
Number 6, the war, ostensibly Russia and Ukraine.
Right. The source makes a very specific claim about the conflict currently centered in Ukraine.
What's the claim?
They state that while it's presented as, a war between Russia and Ukraine,
Yeah.
it is, in their view, in reality, of course, between NATO and Russia, reframing it immediately from a regional dispute to a proxy war involving much larger global powers.
Yeah. And the source alleges the Western media is deliberately misrepresenting this.
Yes. The author claims the Western media deliberately misrepresents the war and suppresses the fact that it was created and is being prolonged for specific purposes.
What purposes?
Specific economic and population control purposes. This goes beyond just saying the reporting is biased. It's an accusation of actively hiding the true origins and intentions of the conflict.
Economic and population control. What does the source claim those specific purposes for creating the war are?
According to the text, the war was created specifically to push up energy prices and food prices.
Ah. So the resulting global economic hardship, higher costs for essentials.
Not seen as an unfortunate consequence of war, but as the primary deliberate goal of starting the conflict in the first place.
Wow, okay. So the author sees the economic pain caused by the war as the intended outcome, serving a specific agenda, and the source contrasts the impact in different regions.
Yes, the author contrasts the damage done to Europeans due to rising prices, saying it was as nothing compared to the damage done in Africa.
In Africa, how so?
Here, the author claims that because of the war's impact on global food and energy markets, hundreds of millions of people in Africa are starving and will die.
Hundreds of millions starving and dying. That's a devastating claim about the humanitarian costs in Africa attributed directly to this conflict.
It is. And how does the source interpret that alleged severe impact on developing nations?
Well, the author claims this severe impact on Africa, leading to widespread starvation and death, is a deliberate outcome. And part of the population control program, which the conspirators regard as essential.
A direct link. The war, its economic fallout, linked directly to an alleged agenda of global population reduction. That's a very severe claim.
It is. The source also makes a direct, specific, and highly accusatory claim about critical infrastructure.
Oh.
They state unequivocally that Biden and chums blew up the Nord Stream pipeline.
Blew up Nord Stream. Why?
According to the source, to maximize the damage done to Europe and Africa and also to maximize American profits.
That's a very specific accusation of deliberate sabotage. against major energy infrastructure, attributing it to a specific political figure, linking it to maximizing both economic damage and national profit.
That is exactly what the source alleges within the document.
Yeah.
And the author predicts the negative impact will continue, stating that next winter will see 10 or 100 times as many deaths as were caused by the well-marketed flu of 2020 and 2021.
Explicitly linking the anticipated deaths from energy and food costs back to their earlier claim about the pandemic's severity.
Right. Connecting potential deaths from economic hardship to their narrative about the alleged fake pandemic. So how does the source connect this war with its claimed economic and population control objectives to the Great Reset?
The author states clearly that the war has directly helped push up inflation and interest rates, which they claim is helping to impoverish millions.
Impoverish millions.
While simultaneously, according to the source, these same economic shifts are helping to enrich the billionaire bankers.
Impoverishing large populations while enriching bankers.
Huh.
That outcome. It sounds like it ties very directly into a phrase often associated with discussions around the Great Reset.
It does. The author explicitly connects this outcome to the phrase, quote, "Remember the phrase, you will own nothing."
There it is.
In the source's view, the war is an engineered crisis, designed specifically to cause economic damage, push populations into poverty, and facilitate the transfer of wealth and assets upwards to an elite, which aligns perfectly with their interpretation of the Great Reset agenda, where individuals lose ownership and control.
So, according to the source, the war, the rising prices, inflation, increasing poverty, all viewed not as unforeseen consequences of conflict, but as deliberate outcomes, serving a planned agenda to strip people of assets and increase control, central to the Great Reset.
That is the narrative woven throughout the document. Every major event presented as a piece of a larger intentional puzzle.
All right, we're halfway through the list of alleged lies. Number 5 touches on another frequently discussed global issue, often linked to environmental concerns. Number 5, overpopulation and food shortage.
Right. The source takes a very direct stance on this one. The author flatly calls the widespread idea that the world is overpopulated and short of food a lie. Just dismisses it.
Dismisses a major global concern as simply untrue. And what does the source claim is the actual truth about global food supply and population capacity?
The author claims the truth is there is plenty of food in the world. The issue, in their view, isn't production or scarcity. It's distribution and waste.
Management, not supply.
Exactly. They state much of the food is simply in the wrong place and is wasted. And as sort of historical evidence for the world having plenty of food, the author mentions EU food mountains, referring to past agricultural surpluses.
The idea that surpluses exist or have existed, and the problem is management and waste, not an inherent lack of food production for the global population.
Exactly. It reframes the problem entirely. And the source goes even further, claiming that evidence shows the Earth can easily cope with many more billions of people.
Many more billions.
Yeah. They assert unequivocally that there is no overcrowding on the planet.
So they reject both the idea of a fundamental global food shortage and the idea that the Earth's capacity is nearing its limit for population.
They do. The author presents this alleged myth of overpopulation and food shortage as just one of many myths which the evil, greedy globalists find convenient.
So framing these ideas not as genuine concerns based on reality, but as manufactured narratives useful to the alleged conspirators.
That's the suggestion. How does the source connect this alleged lie, the idea we're overpopulated and short of food, to the broader picture, the Great Reset?
Well, by framing overpopulation and food shortage as deliberate myths, the source implies they're used to justify other more harmful actions.
Like what?
While the text doesn't explicitly draw a direct line from just this point to a specific Great Reset action, the context within the whole document suggests this alleged lie provides a convenient public justification for implementing policies aimed at, say, population control or resource restriction.
Like the population control mentioned earlier in relation to the war's impact on Africa.
Exactly. This lie provides the alleged narrative framework to make such measures seem necessary, maybe even benevolent, to the general public.
So in the source's view, the claim there's not enough food or space is a foundational deception, used to create public acceptance for policies, potentially including population control, that serve the conspirators' goals as part of the Great Reset.
That's the implication within the document's overall argument. Another piece of the alleged narrative control designed to facilitate the desired outcomes.
Okay. Number 4. This is another very significant point, directly related to the alleged pandemic and its aftermath.
Number 4, the COVID-19 vaccine.
Right. And this is probably where the source document uses its most inflammatory, its most severe language.
How so?
The author's claim about the COVID-19 vaccine is exceptionally harsh. They state it is the most toxic pharmaceutical product ever produced.
Most toxic ever produced. That's an incredibly strong condemnation.
It is. And that it was dangerously oversold to the public. And the author makes a very severe claim about the doctors and nurses involved in administering or promoting it.
What do they say?
The source states unequivocally that any doctor or nurse who gave or promoted the COVID-19 vaccine should be arrested.
Arrested. Why?
The reason given is because, in the author's view, they broke just about every ethical code in existence by doing so.
That's a powerful and sweeping accusation. Claiming healthcare professionals just doing their job, administering or recommending the vaccine, were committing an ethical breach so severe it warrants arrest.
That is the author's opinion, stated directly in the text. Their reasoning, the evidence they cite in the document for these severe claims, includes assertions that patients were not properly consulted before getting the vaccine, implying a lack of proper informed consent.
Okay, lack of informed consent.
And they also claim that vaccine side effects were ignored and suppressed by the medical and political establishment.
So an alleged failure to get informed consent
Right.
and a deliberate cover-up of adverse effects, according to the source.
Exactly. The source also claims the vaccines were rushed, stating they were mass-marketed without being properly tested.
And what does the source claim are the consequences of this alleged lack of testing, suppressed side effects, mass rollout?
The author states they are already observing and seeing awful short-term consequences from the mass vaccination program.
Awful short-term consequences.
And furthermore, they expressed deep fear that the long-term consequences of this program will be awful beyond imagination.
Awful beyond imagination. That paints a truly dire, catastrophic picture of the future impact of the vaccines, according to the source.
It does. The source also claims that the many deaths they attribute to the vaccine program are being misdiagnosed and misattributed, alleging this is part of an ongoing cover-up to hide the vaccine's alleged harm.
What about conditions like long COVID, often attributed to the virus itself?
The source directly challenges that understanding. They claim that the fake disease of long COVID is, when the symptoms are real, a result of the vaccination program.
So a direct counterclaim, asserting that genuine symptoms attributed to long COVID are actually vaccine side effects being mislabeled. If someone genuinely suffers symptoms described as long COVID, the source claims those symptoms are caused by the vaccine, not the virus.
That is the explicit claim presented in the text. And the author broadens their condemnation beyond just the COVID-19 vaccine, stating it's not an isolated issue.
Oh, so?
They claim that numerous other standard vaccination programs for children and adults are similarly causing massive damage to immune systems and causing many diseases.
So the source's deep skepticism and negative view extends beyond the COVID vaccine to encompass vaccination programs more generally, viewing them as broadly harmful interventions that damage immune systems.
That is the author's stated opinion in the document. Quote, "Vaccines, in my opinion, do more harm than good and should all be banned."
Should all be banned. Wow. The source also discusses the behavior of the medical establishment and politicians specifically regarding these vaccines, right?
Yes, the author claims the medical establishment and politicians collectively, quote, prohibited the discussion of vaccines.
Prohibited discussion.
Yeah, they single out the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, describing it as a vile propaganda machine, and claim the BBC explicitly stated they would refuse to interview anyone questioning vaccines, regardless of whether those questioning were right or wrong.
A direct claim of active censorship and institutional bias from a major public broadcaster, according to the source.
Precisely. The author claims the establishment is acting this way because they are terrified.
Terrified of what?
Terrified, the source alleges, because vaccines have never been adequately tested singly or together, and therefore, in their view, all discussion and debate is banned to prevent this alleged truth from coming out.
Okay. How does the source connect the COVID-19 vaccine and vaccination programs generally to the Great Reset?
The author positions the vaccine as a major harmful component of the post-pandemic phase of the alleged fraud.
How so?
It's presented as something actively causing significant, potentially long-term harm to millions while being aggressively promoted, even mandated, through the suppression of any dissenting discussion, evidence, or voices.
So a tool of control and damage.
Exactly. Enforced by silencing opposition. Central to the agenda that followed the initial alleged hoax and lockdowns, it's seen as physically impacting populations in a way that serves the alleged conspirators' goals.
So the vaccine program, framed not as a public health effort, but as a deliberate imposition of a dangerous, untested product, enforced through censorship and control, all serving the broader alleged plan.
That is the narrative presented in the document, the vaccine as a key physical and social control mechanism within the alleged fraud leading to the Great Reset.
Okay, we're now into the final 3 alleged lies on the sources list. Number 3 shifts focus from health and conflict to finance and personal autonomy. Number 3, abolition of cash, introduction of digital currencies.
Right. The source addresses the global trend away from physical cash towards digital payments.
Yeah, it's definitely happening.
The author states that while authorities claim this shift is for our benefit, convenience, fighting crime, that sort of thing,
Yeah.
this is just another deception. The author states plainly, they're lying, of course.
And according to the source, the public has largely bought into this alleged lie, embraced the change.
Yes. The author observes that, sadly, the masses have accepted the lie and are readily adopting these new technologies.
Like what?
They list various forms of digital payment and interaction people enthusiastically using: apps, cards, smartphones, watches, and implants.
Implants too.
Mentioned in the list. This suggests, in the author's view, a kind of passive acceptance by the public of a system being put in place that isn't what it seems.
So the shift in payment methods is seen as widespread, unfortunately embraced by the public, according to the source. But what does the source claim is the real purpose of getting rid of cash? Introducing digital currencies.
The author's view on the true purpose is stark. It focuses entirely on control. The source claims that getting rid of cash, which provides anonymity, autonomy, will allow authorities to control everything we do.
Control everything we do. How does the source elaborate on the extent of this alleged control? That sounds pretty total.
The author outlines a terrifying vision of financial surveillance and punishment. They state they can and will decide what we spend our money on and how much money we can save.
So granular control over individual economic decisions.
That's the implication. But the most severe claim is about enforcement. If we misbehave, they'll simply turn off our money supply.
Turn off your money.
Yeah. And the consequence of this financial cutoff, according to the source, is dire until we either do behave or we die.
Turning off someone's access to their own funds as punishment for misbehavior, potentially leading to death because they can't buy necessities. That is an incredibly extreme vision of future control presented by the source.
It is presented as the ultimate potential consequence and a core reason behind the push for a cashless society. The author states that this outcome was obvious back in February-March 2020, claiming that getting rid of cash was always on the cards, implying this move was planned long ago, a predictable part of the unfolding events that began with the alleged pandemic hoax.
So they claim this move towards cashless was foreseen early on as a deliberate step towards this level of absolute financial control. How does the source connect this abolition of cash and introduction of digital currencies to the Great Reset?
According to the author, this is a direct, fundamental path to total control over individuals' lives.
Central to the agenda.
Absolutely central, because it provides the essential infrastructure for pervasive surveillance and, crucially, punitive control over every single aspect of an individual's financial existence. It's about removing financial autonomy entirely, creating a system where compliance can be enforced through the immediate threat of economic deactivation.
So the global move away from physical cash is viewed not as modernization or just convenience, but as a deliberate, planned step towards establishing absolute financial control and the potential for severe oppression, serving the Great Reset.
That's precisely the argument made in the source document, framed as one of the foundational pillars needed for establishing the alleged new system of total control.
Which, according to the sources list, leads directly into number 2, focusing on the broader context that enables this financial control. Number 2, social credit digitalization.
Right. The source describes this as something that will be a nightmare on your street.
A nightmare on your street.
Yeah. It involves the digitalization of every aspect of our lives, taking everything, personal records, identity, social interactions, transactions, and converting it all into digital data. And according to the author, this entire system relies completely on the internet.
And the author has a very strong and rather unique opinion about the internet itself.
Yeah. Yes, the source expresses an incredibly negative view. describing the internet as the most dangerous and awful invention in human history.
Wow. More dangerous than...
They go so far as to state it is far worse and far more deadly than the nuclear bomb or the cigarette.
That's an astonishing claim. Placing the internet's danger above mass destruction and known carcinogens, it really highlights the depth of the source's concern about digital tech.
That is the author's stated view, emphasizing their perceived threat from the digital realm. They claim that the various apps we use daily are being introduced specifically to help the enemy control everything we do.
So, framing common technology is tools of surveillance and control. Everyday digital tools and platforms viewed as instruments deployed by the alleged enemy to monitor and manage behavior, according to the source.
That's the implication. Based on this view of digitalization and the internet, the author offers a clear recommendation to the reader.
Which is?
Be forever vigilant and cautious about accepting or using new technology. A call for extreme caution regarding digital adoption.
And they single out one particular piece of tech, one that's almost ubiquitous now.
Yes, the author specifically advises readers to avoid smartphones, describing them in very strong terms as the enemy's main weapon.
Calling smartphones the enemy's main weapon really emphasizes the level of perceived threat and control they believe is embedded in personal digital devices. But the author uses the internet themselves, right, to share their views.
Yes, the author acknowledges this necessity. They state they must use the internet, presumably because it's the only widely accessible medium left to them, given the alleged censorship they describe elsewhere.
Right.
However, they explicitly express the wish that it wasn't necessary for them to do so.
So, despite needing to use it, their view remains that the technology itself is inherently dangerous, should be approached with extreme suspicion, or avoided if possible.
Precisely. And like the move to digital currency, the source claims that any notion that social credit and digitalization are being implemented for our benefit is false. The author states emphatically nothing could be further from the truth.
So any publicly stated benefits of digitalization,
Mm-hmm.
or concepts like social credit systems, are just part of the ongoing deception in their narrative.
Yeah.
How does the source connect social credit and this broad push for digitalization to the Great Reset?
The source states these go hand in hand with the abolition of cash, forming a combined system of comprehensive control.
How so?
They claim digitalization creates the necessary infrastructure for a system where compliance is enforced not just financially, but through pervasive digital monitoring and social control mechanisms.
Okay.
It's presented as the means by which individuals can be tracked, judged, scored, and ultimately controlled across all aspects of their lives, behavior, movements, associations. This comprehensive digital cage, built on the allegedly dangerous internet, is presented as absolutely central to the full realization of the Great Reset agenda.
It sounds like they view digitalization and social credit systems as the fundamental operating system, the infrastructure for surveillance and control that makes the punitive measures of a cashless society possible. All built on this foundation they see as more dangerous than nuclear weapons.
That is the comprehensive and alarming connection the author draws in the document, framed as the near-total control grid being constructed.
Finally, we reach number 1 on the sources list. What the author presents as the biggest alleged lie of all, the culmination of the deception. Number 1, man-made climate change.
Right. The source presents their view on climate change in a very provocative way, stating there is no controversy about climate change.
No controversy, that's surprising.
But they immediately clarify why. It's because, in their view, the entire concept as we understand it is based on a falsehood. The author claims there was no climate change until malicious, harebrained idiots started spraying powders into the atmosphere to block out the sun and change the weather.
Wait, spraying powders? That's an exceptionally non-standard specific claim about the cause, attributing any climate alteration not to industrial emissions or widely discussed factors, but to deliberate, nefarious atmospheric manipulation.
That's the claim. So the source's core assertion, then, is that what is commonly called man-made climate change is actually a myth created by evil people.
A myth created by evil people. And the source is very clear about who they believe perpetuates this alleged myth.
Oh, yes. They claim it's perpetuated by bought and paid for media whores, including the entire staff of the world's most crooked propaganda organization, the BBC.
Wow. Explicitly calling climate change itself a fraud.
That's the label used. So the source views mainstream media reporting on climate change not just as biased, but as active, deliberate, paid-for propaganda serving this alleged fraud.
That is the author's strong and explicit claim. They further assert that, contrary to the public narrative, all the scientific evidence proves that there's been no dangerous change in the weather.
Okay, so how does the source characterize the extensive scientific data, reports, observations presented by proponents of climate action, the stuff commonly reported in the media?
The source dismisses all such evidence completely.
Completely.
Yeah, they claim all media evidence regarding climate change consists of lies and super lies based on pseudoscience and based on mathematical nonsense. This leaves absolutely no room for genuine scientific debate on the topic, in the source's view. It's all presented as deliberate deception or just nonsensical data. They completely reject the scientific and observational basis for climate change as fraudulent or illogical.
That is their stated position. The author views the widespread acceptance of climate change as having become a cult.
A cult.
Yes, they claim this alleged cult is carefully managed and controlled in order to deceive and to oppress.
A cult used specifically for deception and oppression. And what about the policies and initiatives aimed at addressing climate change, like net zero targets?
The source is equally condemnatory of policies like net zero, calling them explicitly a weapon which is being used to control and destroy.
A weapon used for control and destruction. And the author uses incredibly strong, almost criminalizing language to summarize their view on both climate change and net zero policies.
They do. The source states there is only one word appropriate to describe climate change and net zero: criminal.
Criminal.
And extending this, they claim the people who promote it are all criminals.
Directly labeling individuals who advocate for or work on climate action as criminals.
Yes. And the author adds another layer to this accusation using highly charged language.
Fuck that.
They call proponents of climate action rabid racists who are mean and nasty and selfish.
Rabid racist. Why? What's the reasoning given for that severe accusation?
Because, according to the source, these individuals are deliberately trying to keep Africa back in the Dark Ages.
Oh.
The source claims they are denying developing countries the chance to progress using affordable fossil fuels, which the author deems beyond wicked.
Linking climate policy directly to racism and a deliberate, wicked effort to prevent economic development in poorer nations by denying them access to energy sources. That's a very harsh and specific critique of climate action motivations.
It is. The author frames denying access to fossil fuels as an act of extreme cruelty and selfishness, driven by racist motivations on the part of those promoting climate action.
How does the source connect this alleged man-made climate change lie, which they've placed at number 1, to the Great Reset?
The author positions this alleged lie as the most significant one, the number 1 lie, because, in their view, it's the concept that most powerfully consolidates control and facilitates oppression above all the others.
As the ultimate tool.
It's presented as a primary tool, alongside the others on the list, used to push society towards the goals of the Great Reset. The cult-like aspect, identifying net zero as a weapon, these are presented as central mechanisms for implementing widespread control, economic restructuring, destruction, all justified by this alleged non-existent or manufactured problem.
So in the source's comprehensive narrative, the entire climate change discussion is framed as a deliberately manufactured crisis, perpetuated by corrupt media, dishonest scientists, used to justify policies that are fundamentally about control, economic destruction, oppression, even racial inequality, all culminating in and serving the Great Reset.
That's the ultimate conclusion the source draws regarding climate change, placing it right at the apex of their list of alleged lies.
So we've methodically walked through the top 10 lies as presented in the source document, following the author's structure, from the alleged fake pandemic and misuse of the PCR test.
Right, through lockdowns, masks, the war in Ukraine reframed as NATO-Russia.
The alleged myth of food shortage, the alleged dangers of the COVID-19 vaccine.
The push towards cashless, the dangers of digitalization and social credit.
And finally, topping the list, alleged man-made climate change presented as a fraud.
And according to the author, while there might be other deceptions out there, these specific 10 lies are presented as the ones most directly and remorselessly leading us into the Great Reset. They're the core components of the alleged mechanism of control.
The source also makes a sweeping claim about the level of commitment to these alleged lies across society.
Yeah, the author states, with absolutely no ambiguity, the entire establishment is committed to these lies.
The entire establishment. That means governments, institutions, media, experts. Everyone in a position of power or influence, in the author's view, is complicit.
And stemming directly from that claim of widespread complicity, the source alleges that anyone who disagrees with what the author calls the conspirators' lies, or who exposes them in any way,
Yeah.
is immediately and systematically labeled as discredited, dangerous, and a conspiracy theorist.
That language is pulled directly from the source document, and the author claims that a key consequence of this labeling, this demonization, is that these dissenting voices are then denied access to the media.
Right. This alleged suppression of alternative viewpoints is absolutely central to the source's narrative about how the alleged fraud is maintained, hidden from the public.
How so?
The author states that none of what they describe as happening would have been possible without the cooperation of the mainstream media and the internet companies.
So the source sees media organizations, major tech companies, not as neutral platforms, maybe not even just biased.
No, as active participants, collaborators even, in concealing this alleged overarching truth.
Yeah, the author claims the suppression of the truth and the demonization of honest doctors and scientists has been vicious and never-ending. That portrays a relentless, brutal campaign against those who challenge the dominant narrative.
Vicious and never-ending suppression. They hold up their own inability to access these major public platforms as proof that the system is rigged to prevent their message from reaching people.
Exactly. And the author goes even further, claiming this removal of free speech was a deliberate, cold-blooded policy which originated with and is managed by the security services.
Security services?
Yeah, they name specific intelligence agencies, the CIA, GCHQ, and others.
Claiming that censorship, removal of free speech, isn't just happening organically because of platform policies or public pressure, but it's a deliberate, planned operation managed by intelligence agencies.
Yes, that's the claim. And the source ties this together by stating these security services have almost total control of corrupt organizations such as Google, YouTube, and Wikipedia.
Wow. That creates a picture of a comprehensive control structure, extending from governments and intelligence agencies through media and into the very platforms people use daily for information and communication.
So, the source's narrative isn't just about governments telling lies. It expands to describe a vast, interconnected control structure involving intelligence agencies, compliant media, dominant tech companies, all allegedly working together to suppress the truth and demonize those who try to expose the alleged fraud and the path to the Great Reset.
That is the scale of the alleged operation described in the document, a pervasive system designed to control information and silence dissent. And the author offers what they view as concrete proof that this deceit is real.
Which is?
The simple fact, they claim, that the conspirators and the collaborators will never debate these issues.
They frame the refusal of individuals associated with the establishment or these narratives to engage in debate as an admission of guilt or fear.
Yes. The author states that they have, for years, offered to debate these topics live on television with the individuals they identify as the chief protagonists and promoters of these lies. But, they claim, these individuals have steadfastly refused to debate.
And what reason does the source give for this alleged consistent refusal to engage in public debate?
The author's explanation is direct. They refuse because, in the source's view, they are frightened that they will be humiliated and their lies will be exposed.
So, the source interprets any reluctance or refusal by opponents to engage in direct, live, televised debate on these specific controversial topics as fear. Fear of being publicly proven wrong and having their alleged deceptions revealed.
That is the explicit conclusion they draw from the alleged lack of debate. And the author urges readers to repeat this challenge endlessly, claiming it proves that everything they say is a lie and is the most effective way to expose the alleged fraud.
Repeat the challenge to debate publicly. Why does the source say this simple tactic is so powerful, so effective in convincing the public?
The author claims that if the public simply sees that one side, presumably the author's side, is willing to debate these contentious issues openly, live, while the other side is not, they will eventually recognize that since we will debate and they will not, then we must be right, and they must be hiding something. It's presented as a straightforward, logical proof point for the public to grasp.
It's framed as a clear litmus test for truthfulness.
Yeah.
Willingness versus unwillingness to debate equals truth versus deception, according to the source's strategy for awakening the public.
It's the author's proposed key tactic for exposing the alleged fraud and convincing others of their perspective. Finally, the source concludes the document with a message aimed directly at the reader, a note of encouragement, almost.
Yes, the author offers a message intended to resonate with those who might feel isolated or alone in questioning mainstream narratives. They state that despite how it might feel, you are not alone.
A message acknowledging the potential difficulty, the loneliness, maybe, in holding views outside the mainstream, offering solidarity.
Precisely. And the author ends with an expression of belief and hope, stating their conviction that more and more people are waking up, and once they awake, they don't go back to sleep.
An optimistic note from the source's perspective, suggesting that awareness of this alleged fraud is growing, is irreversible once attained, and represents a hopeful trend towards wider understanding in opposition to the alleged Great Reset.
It's a message of hope within their narrative, framing the current situation as a time of awakening and growing resistance to the alleged plan. The source presents a sweeping, interconnected worldview where seemingly disparate global events, pandemic, war, economic shifts, tech, environment, are viewed not as organic occurrences.
No. But as deliberate, planned, and harmful components of a single, larger, greatest, and most evil fraud, driven by specific alleged individuals and groups for nefarious purposes of control and oppression.
And the author urges us, the reader, to fundamentally question everything we've been told over the past few years, from the nature of the pandemic, vaccine safety, climate change reality, to the convenience of digital tech.
Yeah, calling for constant vigilance, deep suspicion of established narratives, and a wholesale rejection of mainstream sources and the institutions promoting them, which they claim are compromised.
Thinking about the source's powerful claims, how dissenting voices are allegedly treated, labeled, demonized, censored by an establishment allegedly controlled by security services and tech companies, and the author's asserted refusal of opponents to engage in debate. It really leaves you wondering, doesn't it? In a world where one source presents such a comprehensive, all-encompassing account of global events as a deliberate fraud, and claims the very systems most people rely on for information are actively working to suppress the truth and demonize those who share it. How do you, the listener, navigate this information landscape?
Yeah, what criteria do you use to assess trustworthiness, verify claims, ultimately decide what to believe when confronted with such a stark, totalizing narrative that essentially claims everything you think you know is a lie?
It highlights the profound challenge, really, determining truth and trustworthiness in an environment where conflicting narratives are so deeply entrenched, and where, according to sources like this one, the systems designed to inform us are allegedly part of the deception itself.
It forces you to critically examine your own sources of information, doesn't it? And the basis upon which you grant them authority.
Thanks for tuning into the Despicable Maine Deep Dive podcast. Remember, the United States has been hijacked, so soon living in the United States will be theft of your life. And as always, living in Maine is theft of your life. Every day you are there is just another day stolen.